You're watching The Conservative Talks, brought to you by the ECR Party, your weekly Q&A show on the deeper themes driving the European news cycle. I'm your host, Jorge Gonzalez Galarza. Every week, an expert roster of authors, lawmakers, and newsmakers will join me to unpack the events rocking the European Union's foundations in a short, digestible format from a conservative and Euro-realist angle. Welcome to another episode of our series. Today we are so delighted to be speaking to Ferenc Hörcher, who is a distinguished political theorist and philosopher. He is head of the Research Institute of Politics and Government at the University of Public Service in Budapest in Hungary, and he is fresh off publishing a fascinating and really very thorough and profoundly researched work that is entitled Prudence, Moderation, and Tradition: A Political Philosophy of Conservatism, and the book is out. It's been published in the summer, and it's coming out in a paperback version very soon. But you can already head over to Bloomsbury Books and get yourself a copy. It's a very broad survey into some of the notions that we'll be discussing over the course of our time today, and we'll be asking the professor about them. But really, if I may, Professor, what you try to do in the book is revive a very quaint notion by today's standards, but it's a notion that is very important for us conservatives as we go about fashioning an agenda for governance, and that is a notion of prudence. So I really want to focus on that specifically here to start off with, by asking you if you could maybe outline kind of some of your thought processes, how you came to be interested in the notion of prudence and what you're trying to do for a broad readership, but also specifically for conservatives in reviving the notion.
Right. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. As for the book itself, the idea came when, as a graduate, I was reading that classical book of liberalism entitled The Theory of Justice by John Rawls. Everyone starts their career with meeting with that book, and of course it is based on the concept of justice, which is a very classical term, a long history, and it's we don't usually realize that it's actually a virtue, the virtue of justice. And when I was looking for my own understanding of politics, I was considering what might be the term that expresses my own approach to it. And I thought that, there is another virtue or another cardinal virtue beside justice. And that's prudence. The Romans called it prudence and prudentia, and the Greek called it phronesis. And that's a virtue that goes back to Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, and then transformed by Cicero. And it has a long history, but I think it's a very relevant term if we want to understand politics. Why? Because I thought that the approach that Rawls took was looking at politics as an institutional framework. So it's not so much the individuals that are, or the communities that are participating, but the institutional frameworks, the particular rules and the particular legal entities that can work in it. And I thought that, politics is after all about people, about ordinary human beings. And still, we want to say something that is particularly political. And if you look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in the 6th book of it, he has got a very nice list of the basic forms of knowledge that we have. And one of the basic norms is prudence, or phronesis, as he calls it, practical wisdom, as it's usually translated. And the term is there illustrated with the example of Pericles, the great Athenian leader, statesman. And although he was not actually his favorite political figure, but he understood that he was a successful leader for a long time, long enough time to keep the memory alive for centuries or thousands of years. And the key to his success was this sort of practical prudence, which is an approach to politics that I think is very specific and not similar to many other areas. Why? Because in politics you have to always deal with practical issues, not theoretical ideas like justice or equality or all that. What you have to do is to solve practical problems for your community, for the common good. And the politician, the statesman, is the one who will be able to do it with the help of this ability or virtue, excellence, and that excellence enables him to deliberate, to take into account all the circumstances and decide for the best, or at least the least problematic, the least bad version of human conduct. And that's why I thought that prudence needs to be in the center of my political philosophy.
Well, that's really fascinating, and agreed with it to get started. One of the things that really struck me in the book, Professor, is that at one specific point, you do draw this contrast where you essentially trace prudence all the way back to its cardinal role within the kind of the main ancient virtues. And what really struck me was that, again, you define through the Latin and Greek roots of the word prudence as practical wisdom, even though another of the virtues was wisdom itself, right? Sophia, or the idea of an abstract knowledge. The practical version of that being a more sort of contingent knowledge that emerges from our interactions with other human beings and the practical realities of life. And I wonder, you do explain in the book, drawing on Aristotle, that politics is a combination of the two. We shouldn't shun the universal, or the kind of the objective truth that we should still strive towards, but we should be practical. So what are some of the ways where you see our common politics, our day-to-day political landscape in Europe, across the West? What do you think are the main ways that we're straying away from that specific vision of living life?
Yes, that's a very good point, and then let's address it. I think that there are two ways to be practically successful. One is through prudence, and the other one is cunning, or skillful technical expertise. And that the theorist who was going for that was Machiavelli, the Renaissance author. And I think if you compare the ideas of Aristotle and Plato compared to Machiavelli, the novelty of his approach is that you do not have to consider, so to say, long-term effects or universal principles. What you need to address is just the moment. So you have to find the right means to achieve what is fruitful or useful for you. But that disregards the long-term perspective, and usually it disregards also the common good generally considered. And Aristotle very carefully distinguishes between these two sorts of practical wisdom, and cunning. Because what he thinks is that prudence, practical wisdom, is actually connected with our whole way of life, our whole approach to the natural world, and the human world. So for the Greeks, physis and nomos were connected, the natural world and the human world. And this way, in fact, Aristotle introduces something that we would call natural law. The idea that human behavior is connected to the laws of nature or to the divine intentions, because, of course, right throughout the centuries, all philosophers thought that the human world is embedded into the natural world, and the natural world as such was created. And this way, we can trace back the idea of practical wisdom to that sort of knowledge which leads to the final values that are incorporated into nature. Because, of course, whatever God creates will bear his face on it. The human being has an element of the divine. Why? Because it's the human being is a divine creation. It's created by God, and this way, the natural law brings us from our practical situation here and now to those universal principles that guided the divine inspiration when it created the world.
Sure, and this is a really interesting theoretical fracture, right? It's an altogether different view of politics, and you really do draw that stark contrast in the book. And I wonder, one thing we should make absolutely clear for our audience, Professor, is you've gone into this massive work in your latest book with very much the political theorist's eye, right? You're very much, this is very much a work of theoretical of political theory, and it's very much a work of philosophy. So I wonder to what extent you can maybe bring this down to some your own assessment of 21st century politics. It seems like you're urging conservatives to claim the legacy of Prudence. You obviously explained that it's a legacy that comes all the way from ancient times and that has a very long history through Christian thought and even some modern authors that you cite and quote. But I wonder, where do we go with Prudence and going forward?
Mm-hmm.
What are maybe some of the thoughts? And again, I want to preface this by saying that it is not your job as a political philosopher to offer any sort of to offer this kind of guidance. But if you do have any thoughts about what applying Prudence to our present predicament would look like, can you offer them? Because you do, in the book, you do mention at some point that we're living in an age of unprecedented uncertainty, risk, and that if anything, those particulars of the modern world call for prudence. So if you try to bring it down to our present age, what would that look like?
Well, your listeners should be aware of my national background and the experiences that come with it. So I was born in communist Hungary in the 1960s, which means that indeed my primary experience is that of a totalitarian regime. But I was also born into a Catholic family, which meant that this double education, the state school taught something wholly different from what was taught at home and what I learned in the church. So that means that I had got these two parallel experiences, and as a lesson to learn. And what I learned from that is that indeed politics can be a very dangerous game. It can cause serious harms to hundreds and thousands and millions of people. And the 20th century was perhaps the worst in that respect in human history. So in 1990, I had probably the best moment in my life when the Iron Curtain fell down. And indeed, I'm still happy that I could live, and I'm happy that my father also saw it. And that's why I think that freedom and the possibility to act as an autonomous being for an individual, and also for a community to live autonomously on their own laws. That's the basic thing. And also, I learned that as Edmund Burke, the 18th century theoretician, said about the French Revolution, that politicians should be very careful with influencing human events, because whenever they want to make something better, they usually make it worse. So a skeptical approach, that's my basic idea. And of course, the world after 9/11 is indeed a world where risks are rising, and therefore this skepticism is even more important. And I think that in this respect, in a way, that's a contradiction. The pre-1990 world was a safer world, because there was a balance between two world powers, and that kept a certain balance. And now that this balance is away, there is something like a chaos. An unreadable story is just now opening up. So my suggestion is that politicians should be careful with changes and with the reforms, and even revolutionary reforms are very often the case. For example, in Europe, what we see with the European Union is such an effort for centralization and homogenization that is contrary to my instincts. Why? Because I learned very similar things under communism, and it did not work properly. It worked quite the contrary, against the ordinary people. So I would be very careful with this sort of voluntarism, that human intentions should not be forcefully realized against the ordinary customs and habits of people. I think Brexit, in that respect, is quite a lesson that the European leaders should learn from.
That's a very compelling transposition of the paradigm that you draw, as you call it, the prudential Western paradigm, into our contemporary times, and I appreciate you bringing it down to the present. I wonder. It calls forth. I know you've also been you've done also some very thorough exegesis and some scholarship on the thought of the late Sir Roger Scruton, and as you were explaining how your own prudential mindset unfolds in the present, I was reminded of his dictum that the good things are very hard to build and very easy to destroy, right? And it really reminds one of that sort of prudential mindset. And I wonder maybe if we could also find another let's call it manifestation of this mindset. As we were talking just before going live, I wanted to ask maybe for some of your comments or remarks on the way that, as Western societies over recent months, years, we've come to shift our perception of history. And the reason I want to ask you about history is because it has to do with prudence, to the extent that historical figures, or at least the ones who were successful and that we know of, had to some extent, show prudence and kind of bear that virtue out. So, asking you, as I mentioned earlier, specifically about some of the noxious tendency across the West to want to rewrite history and to look back at the historical figures of the past and point fingers and say they did not live up to the standards of the universal and the standards of the true and the good. We saw that across the West. We saw that particularly over the summer with some of the statue toppling impulses of sections of the American population, but also in the UK. And I wonder, when I saw that happen, I was really reminded of Prudence, because we are not giving the historical figures of the past the privilege of being prudent. We are demanding of them that they be held up to our standards, and in doing that, we do away with prudence, do we not?
Mhm. Well, indeed, it's very important to learn from history and from our tradition. That's why in the title of my book, you see two virtues: prudence and moderation. These are the important, virtues for my political philosophy. But the third word is tradition. I think that you have to be aware that your community, first of all, that you belong to a community. There is no human being like Robinson Crusoe on his or her own. We all belong to a community, and that community does not come out of the blue. That community has generations and generations before it. So if you want to understand its mechanism, its rules that help it survive, you have to study how generations and generations on wisdom, practical wisdom, directed the life of that community. It does not necessarily mean that your community is absolutely saintly, in the sense that they would not have committed mistakes, guilt, and all those human things that are our daily experience. So I think that in this respect, there is a need for a certain tolerance with ourselves. If you are too hypercritical with your forefathers, then what you do is, in a way, to deny your own nature. And whenever human nature is denied, that leads in politics to awful deeds. So I think that modesty in that respect is required, and that modesty will teach tolerance with human frailty. That the human world is a fragile construct, and sometimes it's very interesting that sometimes even mistakes and sins can lead to survival in very indirect ways, because in certain situations you can only choose from bad and worse scenarios, you see. And then if you would only go for the good, then your community would disappear from history. So I think that you have to learn to get along with the history that you have. Of course, it's very important to distinguish the good from the bad. So there is no doubt that you have a critical potential, and you can live with that. I think philosophy actually teaches that sort of a critical approach. But criticism is one thing, and the denial of the past and a hope to restructure the past or even the present is, I think, the sin of hubris. That's what the Greeks called hubris, i.e., to think that human beings are gods. Well, we are not gods. We are human beings. I think that's the basic lesson that we have to repeat over and over again.
Well, this is a really it's been a fascinating conversation, and it's a very enlightening note to end on, with a conversation that will allow our audience, I believe, to draw whatever lessons for the present they would like to. But at the very least, your book does an incredibly thorough job of reviving a repository of wisdom that exists in the Western tradition, and that is there for us to be informed by. So I really want to thank you, Professor, for taking the time for this conversation. Ferenc Hörcher, again, Hörcher is a professor, is a research, he's the head of the Research Institute of Politics and Government at the University of Public Service in Budapest. And his most recent book is called Prudence, Moderation, and Tradition, A Political Philosophy of Conservatism. It was published by Bloomsbury Books. Thank you so much, Professor, for an outstanding conversation.
Thank you, Jorge. It was very nice to talk to you, and thank you for the listeners to have an interest in our talks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Wonderful. That is all the time we have for this episode. If you like what you've watched, stay tuned for future episodes on YouTube and across the ECR Party's social media presence. Thank you.